We're super excited to launch our first public-facing Sawyer seminar of what will be about a year and a half worth of events on the topic creative placemaking, Black restorative ecologies, and Black spatial futures. So we're very glad to welcome our speakers. So thank you all for coming and sharing a little bit of your insights with us today. We want to thank the Mellon Foundation for funding our seminar. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our postdoctoral fellow, Timothy Comfer, for making all of this logistically possible. I'd also like to start acknowledging that this event in Georgetown University are on lands inhabited and cared for by the Piscataway and the Nacotchtank peoples. I want to also acknowledge that land acknowledgements are imperfect tools that are well-meaning, but often fall far short of honoring, acknowledging, and actually offering any type of reparative justice to the folks that are caring for the land. I'm Dr. Amani Morrison and am the lead PI for the Mellon Sawyer Seminar this year. We're going to be running again until about December 2024. Maybe we'll extend into 2025, so just be on the lookout for more events that are coming up. Mellon Sawyer seminars are meant to be temporary research centers that take on contemporary issues, but are grounded in comparative and historical approaches. Today's public session is our first of several, Weathering the Weather, Building Climate Resilient Black Futures. And we're taking on weather in this perspective in a twofold perspective. First, of course, in the traditional sense, referring to the dynamics influenced by climate and increasingly climate change. Secondly, also thinking about the weather in a sense of what Black Studies scholar Christina Sharp refers to in her 2016 monograph, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. In that text, she states, quote, "The weather is the totality of our environments. The weather is the total climate, and that climate is anti-Black." So we can keep in mind this twofold meaning as we move forward with our speakers' presentations and discussions. Before doing so, I want to let you know of our next event, Insurgent Black Ecologies, Wood, Water, and Rebellion in the Great Dismal Swamp. And that'll take place on November 8th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. at the Georgetown Art Galleries. And they're also in conversation with two exhibits that are currently up by Carol Walker. So please come out then. And there'll be reception after that event, and so it should be lovely. So we hope to see you there. But now I'd like to introduce our moderator and our two speakers, and then we'll kind of get right into their presentations. So our moderator and discussant this evening is Dr. Michelle Dovil, who is a research scientist and adjunct professor at Howard University in the Department of Sociology and Criminology. Dr. Dovil's research interests are in disaster research, gender studies, and environmental inequality. She's worked on several projects, both domestically and internationally, in places that include Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Norman, Oklahoma, Wilmington, North Carolina, and also in Japan. Moreover, these projects have been centered on investigating the impact of climate change on coastal communities, inequalities of disasters, improving risk communication for vulnerable populations, examining the protective action and evacuation response of disaster victims, as well as many other environmental inequality issues. And our speakers for today, we have Dr. Dontá Council, who is a dedicated public servant, author, and consultant with more than a decade of experience working at the intersections of nonprofit, government, and applied research. Dr. Council's research and practice investigate and uplift barriers that historically marginalized communities face with disasters and climate change, particularly in coastal communities. In his current role at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, he leads a research and community engagement portfolio that tackles economic challenges to building resistance for low-wealth communities and communities of color across the Southeast. Dr. Council is a native of Newport News, Virginia, and currently resides in Atlanta, Georgia. We also have Professor Danielle Stokes, who is an assistant professor of law at the University of Richmond School of Law. She teaches and writes in the areas of property, environmental law, and environmental justice, with a focus on sustainability and equity in land use planning. Her scholarship on renewable energy and federalism has been published in the Minnesota Law Review. Her article, From Redlining to Greenlining, is forthcoming in the UCLA Law Review. Prior to joining academia, Stokes worked in land use and real estate law with McGuire Woods. A native of Martinsville, Virginia, she's made Richmond, Virginia her home. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stokes, who will lead us, Professor Council, or Dr. Council, who will follow, and then we'll kind of launch into our discussion. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to hopefully navigate to this slideshow efficiently. I think I'm doing a good job so far. Yes. So good afternoon. My name is Danielle Stokes, and I am a professor at the University of Richmond, but I thought it would be maybe helpful to sort of orient who I am in relationship to this project. So that you maybe have a little insight about what informs my perspective and how I came into the research. So I am a native of Martinsville, Virginia, which is a very small town on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. If you haven't ever watched NASCAR, you have no idea where that is, and that's totally fine. But my background was really shaped from a rural perspective. My family lived in an area where textiles predominated, manufacturing, and when that industry moved, the economy of that place transformed into one that is still trying to recover. So much of my life experience has been rooted in being a Black woman from the South in a rural, sort of impoverished area. This project I'm about to talk with you about is actually centered in urban areas, but it also tries to appreciate perspectives from different geographic places because that's my lived experience. So let's, I guess, sort of get into this piece From Redlining to Greenlining. So it developed out of my interest in the intersections between land use, environmental law, environmental justice, and sort of place-based policymaking. And from that, I tried to think about, well, what am I really doing? What concepts am I bringing together? And for me, it is, how do we equitably manage transitions? So right now we're thinking about, or we hear a lot about the energy transition and moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. And that's one component. That's one transition that we're trying to manage. And in this project, I'm really thinking about, well, how do we sort of equitably invest in communities that are the most susceptible to environmental harms? And so we've generally had scenarios where there are standard winners and losers. And often we think about that from a race-based perspective. When I approached this project, though, I tried to say, is there another way to tell this story such that we can reap the benefits from certain policies like the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, that all have these funds associated with environmental justice. So how do we connect funds to people by way of places? And so that's really what was one of the drivers for this project. And so the big picture question is, well, how do we get to a place of climate resilience for all people, no matter the things that have impacted them? So whether you've had housing inequality or access to quality housing, if you've survived substandard infrastructure or you have subpar or standard infrastructure, what happens if you've been nurtured in an environment where you value environmental stewardship? But what happens if you've been nurtured in an environment where there are environmental harms? How do we take any of these cumulative impact scenarios and get us to a place of climate resilience? So for me, part of starting that unpacking was rooted in history. So that's going to inform a big part of this. But I came up with this concept of greenlining. And it is a play on words for the historic injustice that we know as redlining. So this to me is a proactive sort of government measure to remediate the harms caused by redlining, because of redlining, in the wake of redlining. So it's really trying to take a wide scale approach on how do we think about remediating these harms. And so redlining, for those of you who may not know, and just go along on the ride with me. So to those of you who do know, love that, but there may be someone who doesn't. So it's the shorthand way we really think about the homeowner loan corporations' failure to invest in particular communities because they were blighted or infiltrated by particular racial groups. So redlining was this structure that was really rooted in home finance and access to home financing. But greenlining, it tries to go beyond this to take a more comprehensive view of communities, but really taking redlining or that era as the jumping off point. So what is greenlining? Well, we take this approach that sort of mitigates harms that were created by the regulatory landscape that was established when we started redlining. So what is greenlining? Or what does greenlining do? So it utilizes proactive land use planning to demarcate areas where sustainable development and economic investment should be incentivized. What does that mean? Well, for me, sustainable development, or if you've ever came across the term sustainability, it's really this concept that we can think about it as the 3 E's or the 3 P's. You'll see it as different things. I subscribe to the sort of 3E model, which means we contemplate the environment, the economy, and equity. And so at every turn, all of those factors are at play. So for me, greenlining emphasizes each of those components, and while it probably doesn't give them all equal weight, it acknowledges each of them explicitly as we develop policies. Why does greenlining matter? Why is it necessary? Because it acknowledges the fact that certain geographic areas are disproportionately harmed by inadequate housing, undesirable land uses, and the hazards of climate change. And it also happens that certain marginalized groups of people live in these places. So where do we target greenlining? Where does greenlining matters? So that may vary from place to place, depending on past harms and the resulting cumulative impacts. So in DC, maybe the harm that's most pervasive is access to affordable housing. So maybe that's a metric that we would think about for greenlining in DC. As we move through a couple of these examples, we'll see that the harm may show up differently in different places. And so this concept is trying to tailor make a structure that local governments, states can use to really reach between the federal government to get resources down into the places that need them the most. So we'll take a sort of trip back into history, and we've talked about redlining and what it is, but this sort of view shows us what we're talking about. And before I do that, I'll say that there were 2 sort of marginalizing regulation paths. So I'm a lawyer. I like to talk about laws and policies. So on the one track, we have property regulations. So we have things like deed restrictions that tell you who can and cannot live in a particular place. You have things like race-based zoning ordinances that also tell you what type of establishments can be in particular places and what kind of people can be in particular places. And then we have the story of the access to home financing. So within the homeowner loan corporation's sort of underwriting process, there were 2 main factors that I think really exemplify why greenlining is a good remedial tool. So the first was relative economic stability. How sufficient are the industrial, commercial, and other economic attributes of the area, as well as the typical family incomes? So that's one area that we're assessing. How much do people make? What industry is there? And how viable are the businesses? That's one factor that we assess when we're ascribing a grade to a community. Protection from adverse influences. Preventing an infiltration of businesses and industrial uses, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. So that's another large factor about how do we grade this area? Well, who lives there? What types of infrastructure is there? And do we like these people? That's in essence 2 of the grading criteria. And from that, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, graded every city that had 40,000 inhabitants or more. So the areas that were graded A were most desirable, B, generally desirable, C, declining areas, and D, graded hazardous. So I generally focus on the distinction between A and D, just to sort of show and indicate the stark differences between those two areas, but generally the B grade sort of flexes closer to A and C closer to D. So that's the property regulation path. And then on top of that, we have an environmental sort of regulation and marginalization process that we'll get to in just a second. So if we take a look at this map, it's Richmond, Virginia. And if you see the green is sort of fronting on the water. So that's giving us one insight into some of the environmental benefits or possible harms that might be at play once we start to grade these areas. In the narrative of a lot of these descriptions, you'll see things like pristine views, grand vistas, lots of shaded tree cover, really describing these areas as like places you really want to be. And because of that, they had access to home financing. Conversely, in what we would call, so that's the west end of Richmond, and on the east end of Richmond, there were all of the railroads. So between Richmond, Virginia and Norfolk, Virginia, which are the sort of eastern major cities, all of the railroads, in essence, landed in that area. There were incinerators, there were landfills. Any type of facility, industrial facility, was located there. And it just so happened that the people who were located there were typically marginalized groups of people. So low income, Black and brown folks lived in that area. So let's just keep that image in our mind and think about those distinctions. So that was the then picture, and here's our now picture. And what this now picture is doing is really speaking to this environmental harm question and impact by virtue of being in a place that's susceptible to such harms. So back in 2021, a group of great folks at the University of Richmond in the geography department did this heat study. So I'm going to shout them out, as well as our spatial analysis lab, who've helped me come up with these maps. And thankfully, this great data lives there. And so it's easy for me to just say, okay, help me. I want to tell this story. Thank you, researchers who have provided this data. So back in 2021, a group of geographers did this study on heat at particular times of day. And so in this A5 area, which if you recall, it was fronting the water, it was graded A. Back in the Hulk era, this is today, or 2021, that area had an average temperature of 89 degrees on a July afternoon, whereas the D6 area, that was adjacent to the former railroads and these industrial uses, at 91 degrees. 2 degrees, what is 2 degrees? Well, 2 degrees is actually a lot when there's no tree cover, when you have limited access to transportation, when you have limited access to other resources. So this just shows us that at a time when financing was sort of, or home financing was the greatest investment that someone might make in their future, it's created this structure that now has manifested with environmental harms that these folks are less able or less resourced to address. So for example, in this A5 area, it's still the wealthiest area in Richmond, Virginia. The average home income, $250,000. It's still one of the most homogeneous neighborhoods, and it's primarily white. Over in the D6 area, the average income is approximately $62,000. So even if you were going to try to retrofit your home to address the heat, because you can get green windows, new sort of HVAC system, your ability to pay for those features when your average income is $62,000 as compared to $250,000, that's where we start to see how the harms stack on top of each other. So when we think about greenlining, this to me is like a remediation tactic. And if we keep on trend with this Richmond example, well, what would greenlining do, or could greenlining do in Richmond? Well, for one thing, it could integrate these principles of sustainability, so a perspective on the environment, on equity, on the economy, into the way land use planning is facilitated. And so Richmond is actually a pretty well-resourced local government. It has its own planning department. It has folks that do sustainability plans. So it could feasibly, on its own, develop criteria and determine these are the areas where we would like to infuse these benefits that the federal government has told us are available. So for kicks, I decided to think of a few criteria that might be applicable enrichment. So if we decided that any historically degraded area automatically qualifies, if we decided that any area within 1/10 of a mile of an environmental protection agency regulated facility, or if the heat measure was greater than 2 standard deviations above the average, all of those areas would be eligible for green lining resources or federal funding. And what would we do with that funding? Well, we could provide weatherization assistance to places to help circumvent these heat issues. Well, maybe we provide affordable housing units in these areas. So whatever the menu of options would be that would best support these places, that would be at that particular locality's disposal. So it would be implemented across various scales, so from federal down to local governments and community groups, developed with standards that fit specific place-based needs. And then it really helps us to sort of think about what do communities need from that trifecta perspective of environment, equity, and economy. So what are some of the drawbacks, or what are some things that we might want to make sure we consider if we're like, oh yeah, greenlining sounds good? First question is always, well, what about gentrification? What about people who are then priced out of neighborhoods? Well, for me, it is really taking that perspective and baking it into the policymaking process. If we don't want gentrification to occur, how do we bake in no gentrification into our policymaking and do that explicitly at the outset? What happens if there's community disruption and there are new people who move in? If those new people move in because they make new choices on their own, that's just maybe a byproduct, and we have to be okay with that. But we don't want people who are displaced not because of their own choice. What happens if there's an over-inclusion of people who live in the area who maybe they've not been historically harmed? I think that's a risk that I'm willing to take to create communities that are more sustainable for the totality. Greenlining kind of provides inadequate provisions. Well, greenlining is not supposed to be like a climate fix-all. It really takes an approach that thinks about how do we incorporate sustainability and the equity principle into land use planning and development. And then what happens if there's regulatory resistance? Well, I've never seen something that doesn't have regulatory resistance. And we were talking a little bit earlier about the importance of consensus building. And I think that is one of the major parts of this project for me, is having a conversation about cumulative impacts and significant harms in a way that everyone feels invited to the conversation. And we can really think broadly about how do we create climate resilience for Black futures, but for low-income futures, for brown futures, for any group that's historically been marginalized and places that have, in essence, held that marginalization. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to engaging with the Q&A. Thank you.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Hopefully I can transition as seamlessly as Danielle did. I don't know how y'all young people see the small screens. Y'all see it? Okay, awesome. So hello everyone, I'm Dontá Council. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you again, Dr. Morrison, for the invitation, and to be joined by so many esteemed colleagues. I'm Dontá Council. I'm a researcher at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and also a part-time consultant. But before I dive a bit deeper, I do want to give the disclaimer that although I'm not here as an official Fed, these views are mine and mine only, and don't represent the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta nor the Federal Reserve System. So I wanted to sort of start off actually by sharing, and does someone have a timer? Okay, awesome. I wanted to start off by sharing sort of a quick quote that I heard recently from a colleague, Dr. Cassandra Jean. And so she said, "We have to ask hard questions and have hard conversations, because if we don't, Black people will continue to be forced to live hard lives." And sociologists does a lot of work in the disaster space, and just a reflection on a way to sort of ground our conversation. And so similar to Danielle, I'll sort of ground us with what I'll call my climate story. So I'm a native of Newport News, Virginia, and which is about 3 hours south of DC. And I would say like my first big flood experience was in 2003, Hurricane Isabel. I don't know if any folks are from the 757. So that's right, 757. But if you were there in 2003, you will remember Hurricane Isabel. It took us out of the game for about a week and a half or so. But I was in grade school, and I remember how much that really sort of took us out without having power, without having access to the grocery stores, because things were so out of whack in terms of community disruption. And so that experience sort of really helped to inform my thinking around the role of critical government services and infrastructure, and how it's so viable for the function of communities and households. And mind you, this was the era before Apple Pay, and so you can imagine the type of disarray. And thinking about some of my own professional and practical experiences, they really sort of led me to peeling back the layers of what we call resilience. And so really thinking about how governments and nonprofits function to really better meet the needs of communities, and really trying to understand what are sort of the root causes and the ways that we see symptoms show up in societal ills today. And so I had a chance to work in the philanthropy space in the Southeast, and working with nonprofits to fund a lot of work that's moving community challenges around affordable housing, small business development, workforce development, better access to jobs, and specifically disaster recovery. And so I did a lot of work around tornado recovery. And one of my just biggest takeaways is that in the funding space, just systematically, Black folks are just being left out of these large pools of funds, both at the nonprofit space, but also at the household level. And so the ability to cope with disasters, largely depends on someone's ability to be able to pay for these mitigation approaches, and then getting the types of information that are necessary to make those types of evaluations. And so, which sort of lead to my academic interests, which are around data, really trying to focus on understanding what does community resilience mean in the face of sea level rise, in the face of extreme heat, and really trying to peel back these layers around resilience. What does it mean for a community to be resilient? What does it mean to prepare? What does it mean to recover and respond? And so ultimately, sort of my question that grounds my research is, what is community resilience, and how do communities prepare? And so I wanted to sort of start us off by sort of talking about the history. And I think it's important when we talk about climate resilience or resilience for Black people that we start with sort of an economic basis. And so sharing some quick data on the state of economic conditions for Black households. And so with this graph, I would say the most stark indicator around Black people's ability to be resilient in both the current state and the future state is thinking about the racial wealth gap. Wealth is defined as the difference between a household's assets and debt. And so you might think of assets as income from a job, but also the equity that you might hold in your home or other types of investment vehicles. And wealth is super critical when you think about economic turndowns, right? And so when the pandemic, just a couple of years ago, folks were tapping into retirement. They were tapping into their friends and family trying to borrow money because things were so disruptive. But when we look at the statistics from 2019, the median white household held about $188,000, while the Black household held about $24,000, which is about 7.8 times more than Black households. And that Black-white racial wealth gap hasn't changed in about 70 years. And so if you look at some work that's been done by Dr. Alor Darinkot, he's a Black woman economist that's out of Princeton. He's done some really good work to try to understand how wealth has sort of stalled within the last 70 years. And so we haven't really made a lot of progress there. And so what will it take to close the racial wealth gap? And how long will it take it? I think, research suggests that it'll take about 225 years to close this gap. And so when we think about where Black people are less prepared to take on the increasing costs that are associated with disasters, and are more at risk to losing their wealth and being able to preserve that wealth. And so not only do Black people not have the assets to rely on the places to rely on, they're also in places that are riskier in terms of disasters. And so when you look at these sort of two charts, they come from a recent article that I just wrote. And we wanted to look at really what are sort of the characteristics that make Southeastern states in particular more vulnerable to disproportionate adverse economic outcomes related to climate change. And so on the left-hand side, you see the percentage count of individuals that identify as person of color nationally and by state. And so the states that we're interested in are Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And so nationally, about 42% of people identify as a person of color or a non-white racial group. And when you look across the southeastern states, you see that at the state level percentages exceed national levels. And you sort of see that same story on the right-hand side too. On the right-hand side, what we have are national risk scores that are produced by NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And so nationally, the U.S. has a risk score of about 10.6, and the range goes from 0 to 100, which tells us that across the U.S. there's a moderate risk for climate impacts. But when you look at these scores across the southeastern states, you see that they're elevated above U.S. averages. And so looking at places like Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And so really sort of this combined story is really to say the U.S. South is one of the riskiest places that folks can live, and particularly for Black people and people of color. And so I wanted to dive a little bit into, we get into this question about my research, at this nexus of climate and economic vulnerability, how are communities adapting and coping to flooding impacts and other climate-related events. And so I did some research using household survey data and interviews trying to understand these questions and really to sort of start to, again, peel back these layers of resilience about how people are making decisions about preparing for flood events. And so Portsmouth, just to put a little bit of context, again, for my 757 folks, it's a coastal community. It's in southeastern Virginia and located within the larger Hampton Roads region and experienced a lot of chronic flooding. And so through geophysical analysis, it's known as an area that's at risk to chronic sea level rise. It's home to around 95,000 residents with a median income of 40,000, and it's home to about 40%, or at least in terms of population, there's about 40% folks that are Black, about 40% white, and so it's a really unique sort of half and half almost in terms of racial distribution of households. But if you look at this graph, it starts to show a little bit of the story of Portsmouth, and so in the green, we see percentage of populations that live in poverty. And so what you start to see is the darker green are places where there's more poverty. And you start to see that darker green more towards these coastal areas. And you start to see the same story with purple. And so purple is actually where we see flood risk. And so these are some of the highest flood risk places in Portsmouth. And so in our first study, we start to ask folks, what at the household level, what characteristics influence if a household either purchased flood insurance or if they decide to make a structural change to their home. And so these are things like, elevating your HVAC system or even relocation. And so the factors that we assessed included a household's proximity to water, socio-demographic characteristics, and other types of risk perception questions. And so ultimately what our study sort of showed us in this sort of larger framework is that households are more likely to purchase flood insurance or make structural changes to their home if they have direct experience, if they take on personal responsibility to flooding, understand the causes of flood risk associated with climate change and other factors such as race, income, and proximity to a larger body of water. But in this model, because I had to play with this model for a while, I used some survey data. The model tells us that even when Black individuals report having heightened perceptions around risk, and so when you talk about it, you go and you ask someone and say, hey, what does flooding look like for you? You may say flooding looks like it's going to be severe for me, or it's not going to be severe for me. It's not going to impact me for the next 5 years. And so when you take into account these sort of subjective evaluations, even when the theory tells us that when someone sees a risk, they're going to do things to avoid that risk, the data tell us that even for Black households, when they have heightened risk perceptions, they're still less likely to adapt and adopt these mitigation behaviors. And so I wanted to tease this out a bit more and ultimately did a little bit more work in Portsmouth and really just trying to unpack, how we think about decision making, particularly when we think about risk reduction towards disasters. And so we spent some time talking with about 40 families in Portsmouth and a handful of small businesses located in low to moderate income communities to sort of, again, peel back these layers about how people are navigating flooding. And our findings were pretty interesting. One, there were really big gaps between how local governments communicated versus how residents receive information. And so when you think about residents, they often relied on word of mouth, the news, cell phone weather alerts for real-time information. But however, for long-term planning, the city mainly only used its website to communicate flood risk. And so these are things like flood maps that are typically used for new residents or residents that are in place and, to think about where those flood risks are so they can use that in terms of their calculus and making decisions about where they live. But however, many of the participants that we talked to had not even heard of flood maps. Second, there was really an over-reliance on social capital to recover from disaster events or flood events. And so thinking about the role of relationships that neighbors and residents have with each other, meaning the residents relied on each other to store food, to use generators, and find other ways to find support with each other, but oftentimes lacked the type of financial capital really needed to move the needle in terms of recovery and long-term resilience. Renters were less likely to purchase flood insurance, and I think that's pretty known throughout the literature, but engaged in other types of adaptive behaviors, including planning for traffic congestion, relocating to higher ground, and even purchasing vehicles with higher clearance from the ground to avoid car damage. A couple other things that I think that were interesting, these sort of perceptions of how communities think about preparing for disasters and the role of government. And so one of the big challenges that came out of this was actually talking to unhoused individuals that had been over-criminalized in Portsmouth. And it was just really interesting to sit back and hear their stories about how, I came into this project thinking that, we're just going to talk about flooding and that's going to be it. But you start to uncover how systemic these challenges are and how the environment exacerbates challenges for people who are already in really, really crappy places. And so when we talk about even unhoused individuals, folks who are trying to manage not having a place to live, but also rising waters. And when they're trying to relocate to a higher ground, particularly a parking garage, they're arrested by the police, right? And so you start to see how these environmental challenges really start to exacerbate existing issues in communities. And one of the resounding sentiments was that Portsmouth doesn't care about Black people. And so I think that what we did with this work was actually, this work was done in request to the floodplain manager at the time in the city of Portsmouth, because they were in the middle of their comprehensive planning process and realized that they had not heard from a certain segment of the population. And we're really trying to be intentional about understanding what were the concerns of communities that are at disproportionate risk, and what does it mean to include their lived experiences when we think about moving the needle on flood mitigation. And so I think we're going to talk about this a bit more in our Q&A, but just a couple of things for us to sort of chew on as we think about, what is considerations for climate resilience in Black futures. So in this sort of time, I think we're moving to this high carbon to lower carbon economy. What does it mean to have, I think, this down payment from the IRA, IIJA, and other types of fiscal policy? What does it mean to take advantage of that? But also, I grounded this conversation in the racial wealth gap. How do we make sure that that doesn't widen? How do we make sure that we're actually getting closer to closing it? And so I think that there are a few areas, and I'm happy to chat more about them, I think, in our conversation, but really thinking about the role of economic empowerment and the role of wealth creation, accumulation, and preservation. They're all necessary components for the viability of Black communities. Some communities, some Black people don't have wealth, and I tell people all the time, I may be seen as someone who has higher income, but I'm worth like negative $48,000. And so when you think about what wealth does and how wealth can predict life outcomes, it shouldn't be that way, but we know that that's the case, right? And so what does that mean to be able to give people opportunities to create wealth, to accumulate wealth, and to be able to preserve it? And thinking about, so you have assets, homes, savings accounts, investment vehicles are primary ways that people build wealth and network. And many of the communities that I work with, again, are not just low income, they're low wealth. And so they may have the income, but they may not have the assets. And so what does that mean in terms of creating the type of safety net that people need to be able to liquidate things in times of disaster? And also creating pathways for Black businesses to get involved in the green economy to ensure long-term employability, high-quality benefits such as retirement and pension plans. I think this other piece around equitable access to green infrastructure and financial products, I think my colleague has already sort of hit the nail there. But I'd really like to think about this in the role of risk reduction and risk transfer. And so risk reduction are actions that reduce the probability of adverse impacts. So like high electric bills, the increase for heat-related illnesses. But you can't reduce all of your risk. In some places where you live, the heat's just going to be hot and the flooding is just going to come. And so you also need ways to transfer that risk. And so when we talk about risk transfer, we're thinking about like financial instruments such as insurance and the role of insurance. And so when we see in places like Florida and Louisiana where insurance companies are pulling out in residential coverage in places, that leaves people vulnerable to having to take care of the expenses associated with the structures of their homes when you think about the types of damage that can happen in the face of climate change. And then the last piece is just, I think, there's a huge opportunity to continue to do climate education and community engagement. When we think about the long-term viability of Black communities, we need to be having conversations about what climate change is. And I think we had this conversation earlier. Climate change is not just sustainability and recycling, right? I think that we have to really think, and people know this, but I think that we really have to embed those principles in and institutionalize them into city and government planning and find ways to hold government accountable. And with that, I think that's it.
Takes a minute. Oh, good evening, guys. Thank you guys again for coming out. Thank you guys, the panelists, for just a great conversation that we're going to have. And so we'll have a short discussion, and then we'll go into questions and answers. And so I personally have a question based on your work. I do a lot of work centered on this concept found in environmental psychology, place attachment, that suggests that people have an emotional bond to their place or land. And you guys are talking about being climate resilient. And I'm starting to see that looks different for different communities, especially vulnerable communities. I just came from the HBCU Climate Change Conference, and there was a panel on community leaders who were being impacted with the saltwater intrusion. It was in New Orleans, flooding, extending the highways throughout their communities. And for them to be climate resilient, it meant not to be pushed out from their communities. And so they're trying to find ways to stay in these risky, vulnerable areas and land. And to me, as a research scientist and professor, climate resilience looks like relocating them. And so what are your thoughts on that? Like, climate resilience looks different, this concept of place attachment. And as we continue to face climate disruptions, how does that look with relocating, displacement, migration?
I can take a first stab. So I guess I'll start one by saying, when I heard the title of this panel and weathering the weather, and when I think about weathering, it's like a laborious task. Like, it's not something I would want to do. I don't want to weather. I want it to be okay. And so when I thought about, sort of making place and future, but this question makes me think about home. And home should not be a place where I have to weather, right? It should be my safe haven. And so as I think about planned decline, like, that's the nice way to say forced relocation. In the planning world, they say planned decline. And I think it goes back to the narrative and what matters to us. And while I'm attached to places, like, I love my grandmother's house, I love Georgetown, there are things and places that I love. But more than that, I love my existence, and I love the ability to be autonomous in my being and not have to weather. And so I think inviting people to think about home as not the physical location, but it being another place where we exist at peace and aren't weathering. Now, how do you get people on board to subscribe to that or to think about it differently? That's a task. But just like we're trying to invite people to consider climate and climate resilience differently, I think we have to consider home differently and the things that we're attached to, and what are we willing to give up for maybe our benefit and our protection and our preservation. Because I do think there's a give up for gain. There's always a transaction cost. And I think for me, it's reconceptualizing the notion of home so that I don't have to weather in a place that I should be at peace, is how I would like to invite people to think about that.
Hello? Okay. Yep. So that was very powerful. And just this concept of home and rethinking what home looks like. I was just having a conversation with the law professor last week who was pursuing grant funding, who's been working with some farmers in in rural Georgia, and one of the things that they heard in their planning efforts was that they'd be willing to, the farmers were willing to relocate themselves, but they wanted to take their history with them. They wanted to take their homes. They wanted to take their burial grounds where they had been settled for years. And this professor was so shocked that this was an aspect of planning, and had not necessarily considered as an aspect of planning. But if you had done your homework, you would have gone back to the principles of EJ, environmental and climate justice, and you would know these things about self-determination and the right to live where you are. And so I think that we have to continuously consider, I think the work that's already been done to set this sort of fertile ground around the environmental justice movement. There are principles that have already grounded us in space. So when we think about place attachment, yes, we should definitely be thinking about the cultural aspects and the things that we know as home, because that provides us safety. And so I think we also have to redefine what safety looks like under the guise of resilience. And so when we think about safety, oftentimes safety looks like being able to be close with my family. And if you're not close to them, then that compromises your safety. And so what does it look like potentially for what could be mass migration? One other aspect I actually sort of thought about was sort of, yes, we should be considering these cultural aspects, but, I have a family member and a few friends who have been displaced because of, for energy costs. And so the rising cost of energy during the heat in the summertime. And so, when you think about the role that climate is playing, even though these are places that folks are attached to, they're being pushed out anyway, right? And so I think if we want to be humane, if we want to do this transition something just, we have to be cognizant and considerate of their attachment to place, their sense of belonging. Because while I know that policy doesn't always include empathy, I think that we're sort of at this place where it has to, and we have to institutionalize empathy somehow in the policy making process in order for folks to be met with humanity.
Thank you, guys. Another question is, what practices or policies are essential to creating and sustaining abundant forms of Black existence?
The policy landscape, I can't say has always been friendly to Black people. But what I can say is that social movements have been friendly to Black people. And so when you think about one of the core principles around social movements is this ability to build consensus, right? And so the ability to grow numbers and to have people that are alike that can advocate for and speak to the same types of issues. And so I think that while policy moves at the space of trust. And when we think about the role of like nonprofits in the advocacy space, I think that there's been a lot of movement there in terms of thinking about, there are folks who are championing for specifically Black-led, Black-oriented policies and practices. And being race explicit isn't being race exclusive. And so I think that as much as we can be explicit about the target population and why and the justification behind it, I think that the policy moves in that direction.
So I would say that's maybe one point where we diverge in terms of policy proposals and how do we go about maximizing benefits for the greatest number of people. I'm a bit of a pessimist and cynic because I study law and have to think about risks and pros and cons and practicality. And for me, that the explicit is what is divisive. And so explicit racial targeting and discussing benefits for a particular group, then it's well, do we have an equal protection problem? Do we have a reverse discrimination problem? And so for me, it is policy making and perspectives that are rooted in consensus building, right? Recognizing that there are multiple groups with various levels of power and various assets and resources, but acknowledging that at the outset and building consensus with power brokers who can then say, I understand that perspective. I recognize that there is common ground as between you and me, or as between you and my neighbor, and I understand the end goal that you have in mind. So for me, it is so much more about learning to talk across difference, learning and instructing people in modes of civility. When I think about our current policymakers, I'm disheartened, disappointed, and like, don't text me asking for a donation for your campaign because you don't know how to act. That's sort of what my gut says. But I feel a responsibility to have these conversations about how do we engage civilly? How do we speak across difference? And for me, the way we get to these abundant Black futures is to recognize there are power brokers in this game. How do I engage with them? Or take the abolitionist perspective and say, how do I totally remove myself from that? How do I defund that? But recognizing that there is a power broker. And at some point, there has to be a meeting of the minds. I'm not a dismantle girl, right? There are people who speak about dismantling. Because of my realism and practicality, how do we take what exists and use it to our benefit? How do we take an existing structure and infuse a new perspective and invite people to be empathetic, invite people to engage with issues related to equity before they start talking about how much it costs? So for me, I think those are the policy-making tools that help us get to that place.
Thank you, guys. And I guess I'll just ask one more question before we jump to Q&A. You guys talk a lot about futures and climate resilience. And so where do you see Black people in the future?
I'll take a quick stab and say that, as much as when we talk about climate change, it's such a sort of catastrophic framing, and it's such this immediacy and this urgency to act now. And but ultimately, I see Black people thriving at the end of this reckoning with what does it mean to honor Mother Earth and to be able to implement that through policy making and through practice. And so, in a very real world, though, I do see us moving more inland. When we think about the actual geography and topography of the U.S., I don't think that when we think about the racial makeup of coastal cities and port cities, we're going to start to see the decline. We're going to start to see the decline of Black people and people writ large, I think, in these areas. But my hope is that we're able to, that communities and Black communities feel safe in where they are, and wherever they feel safe, that there are protections there.
So I find it a little challenging to answer that question, given the state of the world. Like, what is the future look like, period? So I'll just acknowledge that I have difficulty really forecasting long distance future, right? Like right now. But for me, I think I hope that the Black future is a place that allows people to slow down and reassess these things that we're talking about. Like, what does it mean for me to be at home? What does it look like for me to take time to go outside and be able to do that without the risk of being harmed by heat exposure, without the risk of inhaling toxic fumes? Can I live in a place comfortably and at ease in myself and in my community and not feel like I'm rushed and not feel as though I'm having to do something urgent and be taxed? Can I engage with the environment and be at peace? Like, I see that as a possible future. I think we've worked very hard and created the culture of go, go, go. And when COVID invited us to pause, we paused for a second and then we picked right back up and kept the steam ball rolling. And so for me, I would hope that a future is one that begins to prioritize the value of the natural environment so that we learn how to be better stewards of that, because I think that's what created longevity for generations prior. And if we take the resources and knowledge that we have now and incorporate that sort of environmental connection into who we are today and the resources we have today, that leads us to this sustainable Black future in my mind.
Thank you, guys. We'll do Q&A.
I really didn't expect to get picked on first, but I was taking my shot. First and foremost, excellent panel, excellent discussion. Thank you for coming and visiting us. My name is Langston Swafford. I am a master's student in environment sustainability management here at Georgetown. I'm from New Orleans, actually. I also work with the Climate Center at the law school doing research on climate change adaptation tactics and possibly coming up with solutions, specifically in my case for the city of Savannah, Georgia, and the city of New Orleans. So I'm very New Orleans centric, right? So when I hear about like placement and displacement of a majority black city such as New Orleans, I start to feel a little bit weary, because my first questions, and I have notes, I have a lot of notes, but like a lot of like my questions start to come around, you know, like you mentioned saltwater intrusion. There's a certain level of, you know, there was an article I read on CNN yesterday talking about how a lot of citizens in New Orleans have sort of an apathetic kind of take towards government right now, kind of like to what you mentioned, sir. And it just seems to be in a disarray, and when citizens don't care, it's easier for people to start saying, okay, well, we can move them. So, but the thing is that when I think of places like Boston or New York, other coastal or semi-coastal cities, are those people going to have to be displaced? I mean, they say New York City is sinking. No disrespect to New York or Boston. I went to school in Boston. But like, when we mention those places, is displacement going to be at the forefront of their consciousness? Why does it have to be New Orleans? I mean, the city of New Orleans has already been deemed refugees, like we were deemed refugees during Katrina. So if we are in a position to have to be displaced, are we going to even be accepted by the rest of the United States? You know, so I know that's a lot. I apologize, but this is just a great conversation. But thank you.
Oh, well, yeah, I love New Orleans as well. It's my favorite city. And when we talk about displacement, I study the impacts of climate change on coastal communities. We're talking about the whole United States and also those abroad when we're talking about being displaced. And when we look at these sea level projections, they're projecting that within the next 15 to 25 years, it won't be a conversation. These cities will be underwater. I'm from Miami, Florida, my city included. So, yes. And so I do understand your question when we talk about that. What was the second question?
Is there a method to, like, how can we know that black people are going to be done right? You know, how are we going to, you know, like, that's the question. And is there, like, kind of a comparison between a city like New Orleans that's majority black, I mean, affected the economy and most of tourism, and insular versus a city like maybe Boston and New York are the financial capitals of the Western Hemisphere?
No, you're absolutely right, because when we talk about individuals, especially vulnerable populations, we talk about the deserving and undeserving poor. And so with Hurricane Katrina, we see that with the vulnerable and the vulnerability, right? And so we know that there are vulnerable and poor communities, but as our landscape within the United States, when we're talking about white supremacy, capitalism, and the patriarchy and stuff, there are some people that are deemed undeserving even when they are in the most desperate situations. And so that's part of my fight, and that's part of the fight as it relates to environmental justice. We want to see that it is equitable. We want to see that it is a just, fair, and equitable transition. And so it is our heart's mission and our goals to make sure that we are treated fairly and equitable if it comes to the point where we have to be displaced and relocated. But yeah, if we leave it up to the government and other individuals, then yeah, we will suffer even in relocation and displacement, right?
I think the only things that I would add are, you know, in thinking about the planning privilege isn't a privilege that most black people or households of color have in terms of being able to set aside time and actually build the building blocks towards a strategy that helps to reduce and reduce risk long term. You know, many communities are sort of caught up in the immediate, in the right now, right? And so I think there is this challenge of, you know, if folks are apathetic, does that really move the needle in terms of the places where it makes the most sense? And I think that, you know, this movement waxes and wanes, and so there are times where people fall into it, and there are times where folks fall out of it, and then there's sort of the anchor institutions of folks that are sort of through and through. And I think that you have to, in this space, you have to sort of consistently be engaged to understand where those spaces are, in terms of being able to, I think, check the temperature around, you know, if apathy is so low, what does that mean in terms of advocacy on the nonprofit space or in the government space? And if folks aren't filling that gap, what are you doing, right? And so I think that that's the biggest piece in terms of, for many people in this space like myself, you know the issue so well, and it's like, oh well, who's going to come around and save us? And ultimately, it's ourselves, right? We have to create the firms and the nonprofits and the capital infrastructure to be able to absorb the information and the actual finances to deploy it ourselves, right? And so, I'm not I come from the nonprofit space where we can usually speak very freely and we're usually very forward thinking and can talk about these things in a way that doesn't always move at the speed of government. And so when we think about planning privilege, we have to think about, our communities being included in the planning process in these localities, in the municipalities. And so if you're looking through your plans and you don't see sections where they talk about populations at risk, vulnerable communities, and having some accountability measures, then there's a likelihood that communities will fall by the wayside because there's no incentive to hold people accountable. And so,
Could I just ask one question? Because the entire time when I heard that question, I was curious, and if you will show your hand, I would love it. How many of you have been to a planning commission or planning meeting or community meeting when it's talking about development? Okay, so we have a few, right? There are people who have never gone to a meeting, who don't know meetings exist, who don't even know that they have the opportunity to be heard and raise concerns about development. So even if we go out and tell one person or ask one person, what would you do if there was development coming to your area that you didn't want? What would you do if you were dealing with saltwater intrusion? Do you even know where to go? And so I think even building that knowledge base within communities, because we say they're apathetic, but are they apathetic or are they uninformed, right? Do they know, oh, I can go to this person, it's their job to listen to me, right? And so if you are met with resistance, that can create some apathy. But I'm also convinced that some people don't even know that they're empowered to go and speak to their local officials. So I think that's really one thing that people with resources and time and capacity can do on behalf of the underinformed or apathetic is to teach them how to use their voice and let them know what tools are available to sort of move that needle. Because no one is going to save anyone, right? No one is in the government is coming in with a cape on and saying, we want to save you if you don't put pressure on those power structures.
Another thing I wanted to add is when I was at that conference, it was, again, a community leader from not New Orleans, but another small community. And they said they have been dealing with saltwater intrusion since March. They didn't make it a big deal until it started hitting the more wealthier neighborhoods. And they've been fighting for this since March. And so with empathy, these communities are fighting and they're on fire trying to get the word out. The issue is the gap in our generations. They don't know how to use technology. They've admitted that you guys have TikTok, you guys have the social media. There's like, we need you guys to come and help us get this word out because it is a digital age and we don't know how to do that. We're getting the word out in our communities, but how do we bridge the gap where our generation, how to turn a Word document into a PDF is a huge thing. You know what I mean? And so I wouldn't say the apathy question. It just depends on who it's impacting. And when it is those poor neighborhoods, they don't care until it starts hitting more wealthier, wider neighborhoods. And bridging that gap between the generations, we have to get the word out.
Hello. My question is, currently in class we learned about prefigurative politics, which is basically the idea of just, organizers living in whatever future they're trying to create right now and doing what we want to do as, environmental justice advocates right now and not really waiting for the okay. And then there's also the side of, abolitionists as well. And I know you said yourself that you're not really someone who's keen on dismantling. Can you expand on that a little bit more? And, does abolition have a space in the EJ discussion and framework?
So this is me. So I'd like to leave my personal perspectives out, in like when I'm in my professor role. So I'm like, I hope my students don't see this. But anyway, so for me, I am a rule follower. Like I am a rule. Like give me the rule, I'm gonna stick within it. If it's an unjust rule, I don't necessarily. If the rule is applied, let's say unjustly, I have an issue with that, right? And I'm gonna work to ensure that the rule is applied equitably, because to me, rules are necessary. When we start to think about abolition, my concern is there is chaos. there is a structure that says the rules are out the window and now we're just going to act. And so that gives me more pause than reform. That's just my style. That's my take. Because how do you enforce chaos? Because to me, sometimes abolition can feel like this period of chaos. And I'm a slow change person. I'm not a rapid change person because I'm methodical. I want to test it out. I want to see how it works. And I think that's a preference, right? I think the world needs both push and pull. The world needs people who are slow and steady. They need people who are quick to the draw. They need people on the street. They need people in the boardroom. And so for me, my lane has not been at the forefront, on the ground, being sort of like in the face and calling for abolition. I'm more of a, what's the structure? How do we build a structure that gets results? And that just to me is a difference in strategy. So do I think there's room for abolition? Sure. Is it my style? It's not. That doesn't make either better. But for me, I'm concerned that we live in such a volatile governmental state that in the absence of rule and when there's chaos, it leads to greater destruction or quicker at the draw destruction that it's harder to rein in. So that's my hesitancy when I start to think about abolition without parameters, right? Or if we say abolition because we're taking something and we're removing it wholly, it has to be replaced with something. And so for me is understanding what's being replaced from what's being taken away. And so I'm hesitant to say I'm abolishing because that interim period sounds like chaos.
I just want to add that I'm not an abolitionist, but I would like to. I like to think of. So I come from public policy space where we talk a lot about incrementalism and nudging, and so there's this slow creep when we think about policy making and policy implementation. There's not a lot of risk that governments and policy makers will take in terms of abolition. So creating a new system and throwing them away isn't a huge reality. But I do sit at this sort of spectrum or continuum in terms of thinking about. While an abolitionist sort of framing and ideology and approach is helpful, I think that there is some need for balance, right? And so when we think about the need for new systems and new structures and honestly new societies, we do need ways to organize those societies. The reality is that we're humans of creatures of habit. And so we do things repetitively. We do things because our minds like repetition and we like things that are safe to us. And so when we start to get out of the bounds of that, absolutely, I think there's a lot of risk there. But when we think about, but I think that we wouldn't have gotten to this movement when we think about the just transition without the activists, the folks who are working in advocacy, the young activists who are continuing to uplift these challenges. And so I think we see material benefits from that sort of approach and framing of the challenge in ways that I think are going to be helpful. And I think we need folks that can help. I'm one of those folks that can be sort of forthright. So we need folks that can help pull us back and say, all right, we have the money now. Let's be strategic about the actual strategy. And so we need folks that can sound the alarm and raise the flag. But we also need folks who can sit at the table and cross the T's and dot the I's to make sure that things are done in decency and order.
Add my 2 cents. I think I'm on the other end of the spectrum. I'm all about the chaos. I'm like, burn it down. None of this stuff, thank God I didn't curse. None of this stuff is sustainable. We're in a public health crisis, an economic crisis, a climate change crisis, an educational crisis. We're in a crisis. We have 2 wars going on and we don't even have the funds to sponsor them. The Congress is in chaos. And I tell my students all the time, like, we need to get on our Zooms, babes. Like, when is the revolution? I'm ready. But I do tell them, you guys are absolutely right. There will be a period of pure chaos. I'm like, name any revolution where there wasn't bloodshed, guys. It will be volatile. It will be bloodshed. And people will die for liberation, right? And that's just what it is. And maybe it's part of my personality. I'm an Aquarius. I'm like, burn it down, start it over. There's going to be a period of chaos. We understand that. And we know people with power and money act differently, and it can be, and there's a chance that it might not work out. We recognize all the flaws in it, but I'm willing to take that risk for liberation.
Oh, okay, cool. But yes, this has been so important. I've enjoyed this talk so much. One thing I want to return back to, a follow-up question about like the whole in between and intersection between placemaking and risk management. And my peoples are from Richmond, so it's like, and they're Black people from Richmond, so they have a history of displacement. So like it's like being from Jackson Ward, being from a flourishing Black community, and then a highway going through your community, making it so you can't live there. I even talked to my grandmother, and she's like, the idea of moving like makes me sick. Like it's a mourning process to move. And so it's like, I guess, but then alongside that, Dr. Council, you were talking about, like, maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but like the whole thing in Portsmouth, when they said that they valued social capital and they kind of created communities to help themselves in the environment. I guess like my first question is like, we do have like things in the community that we're working to create environmental justice in our spacehood. What space does that do like for the policy realm, if that makes sense? So like, what can like the things that we've created in response to the pain that has been caused to us, what space does that have in the policy realm? I think is like a question that I'm interested in hearing y'all talk about. And then also, sorry, I forgot my other question. How do we facilitate creating home when you're gonna leave it? So when we know that in 25 years, there will not be space for us here, what kind of like material do we take with us? Maybe not like physical material, but like figurative material, social material.
Great questions. And I keep coming back to this idea of like, what's the ethos of what we're doing? Like, what is built into decision making, right? Yes, capitalism. Yes, power. That's been the ethos of governance and regulation here. Does it have to be? No, right? So if we want to talk about abolishing things, to me, we abolish a perspective that says power and privilege predominate. So if we had a culture where we shape perspectives in the direction that says, I care about other people, I'm not trying to maximize profits, that to me, that's the kind of abolition I'm game for, is changing of perspectives. I don't want to burn stuff down because I got nice stuff and I want to keep my stuff. Okay, like I'm gonna be real, because when whatever starts to burn, I'm not insulated. As Dr. Councilman mentioned, I'm a high earner, but I'm not wealthy. I'm not able to pack up and go somewhere and live a better life. I'm just not. And so when I think about that reality from my perspective, I'm always inviting people to think differently, right? If you think differently, and if you all were to go out into the world and become the decision makers, we bake these things into how we govern. We bake these things into how we interact. And I'm much more interested in investing in that perspective. Will our grandmothers get that perspective? Only in the conversations we have in the living room. And in their lifetime, will they start to see and understand and maybe disassociate from the harm that was caused to them? Maybe not. But can we take that lesson and now infuse that into how we move forward? Yes, we can. And so when they come with a plan for a highway, I can come in and say, that's unacceptable because you haven't considered the risk, the place, the people, because I have the vocabulary and the knowledge and the understanding that can speak to the things that are important for that decision. So I think for me, it's really about shaping that perspective. What is home? What are the things we take away? We take away a perspective that remembers we were harmed because we had no voice. We were harmed because we had no power. But guess what? We actually have a lot of that now. And am I using it? Am I maximizing the use of that power? Am I able to take the little something? Because for me, I felt like I was given a little something. And what I was able to make from that little something is so much more impactful than what I could have imagined. So I'm encouraged. Like, I'm still an optimist, even though I'm a pragmatic pessimist on something. I'm optimistic that people can change if we give them the opportunity to. And I'll just stop there.
I don't know if I have a lot to add to that. These are really good questions. these are really good questions, and honestly, I think these are some things that I need to probably chew on for myself. But the sort of first things that sort of came up for me were, just never underestimating the value of civic infrastructure and table setting. And so when we talk about the places and spaces that we make outside of public policy, we need to sustain those places and tables. And so when we think about the building blocks for flood mitigation or development that might disrupt a community, a lot of times I think about, communities have powerful visions about how they want to see their communities thrive and what that looks like for them. And a lot of the times getting to that place, particularly when we think about development patterns or, strategizing about what do we want communities to look like, it's getting communities from shovel-worthy projects or shovel-worthy ideas, if you will, to shovel readiness, right? And so what does that look like in terms of the policy space? As folks, giving Black folks the power of planning privilege to sit at tables, to be able to sustain civic infrastructure. I don't think, I just keep going back to that in terms of how we think about policy making and what that means for folks who have an idea about what they want to see. It's just getting to the table. And then oftentimes the table is the biggest place. And so, when we talk about these ideas around, my grandmother doesn't want to leave either, right? She lives right next to a swamp, which floods all the time. And so, so in her lifetime, we may not ever have the conversation where she'll get to relocate, but we know that with some of the financial literacy and the climate literacy, we can start to have those conversations about, all right, so what does it look like for the next generation to live here, to be able to preserve this wealth, and to be able to accumulate beyond that, right? And so, yeah, really, really hard questions.
Okay. I think that's a really powerful question. I'm going to start putting that in my lectures and classrooms. I'm serious. Like, what do we bring with us when we are displaced and relocated? And I think when we're looking at these systems of oppression and exploitation, right, colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, anti-Blackness, all these things, they're violent systems, right? And they work to dehumanize us, exploit us, and oppress us. And I think we do that opposite, right? We bring the community, right? Like, we live in this individualistic mindset by design, right, with these systems. And we have to get back to community, right? That's the only way we're going to survive. That's the only way we have been surviving. And so reimagining what community looks like, digging deep into that community, right, with these social ties, and humanizing ourselves again. And we know we see each other as humans, right? But we know these systems don't. They work to dehumanize us, and they're very violent. And so, yeah, I think that's a great question. But I think we really have to center ourselves on community, again, at the heart of it, right?
Okay, so technically we're at the end of our session. Someone has the room after us at 5:30. So I will let a quick question and a quick response go because our conversation has been so lovely, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi. Oh, wow, that's loud. Thanks for being here. This is a really good conversation. I'm a graduate student in the urban planning program, so I love talking about resilience planning. I'll keep it short. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the funding landscape. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the public sector can't do this work alone. It's going to require like a huge relationship between the public and private sector. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about what that's looking like.
I think very quickly, what we have right now in terms of fiscal policy is an opportunity for what I think is a once in a lifetime down payment for investing in resilience. And so I think that the challenges currently are, there's so much excitement in government. There's less guidance on what that means in terms of being able to deploy that capital. So meaning that money can actually reach communities. And so when we think about sort of, I think the funding landscape, I think it's going to take a lot of work from communities in partnership with public dollars to be able to think about long-term investment in resilience. And so I think a lot about what's the role of financial institutions. A lot of the work that I do is looking at the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, which, by sort of background, helps to promotes lending from financial institutions. So basically, it's to remediate thinking about housing discrimination and redlining. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is actually trying to think about, like, how do we not only have a down payment through public funds, but how can we also leverage those funds through private dollars, and to be able to think about sustainable workforce development practices, sustainable, affordable housing. And I think it's going to take much more than what we have, at the table in terms of federal dollars.
Do I see or what have I seen? Not a lot, because the funds are just now like starting to trickle out. What would I like to see? I think it goes back to Dr. Council's point about who's at the table. So when I think about even my own self being at a decision-making table, the things I'm advocating for or where I'm advocating for dollars to go. When I'm in the company of a decision maker, I'm doing that same thing. So when I think about like the access that you all have even in these programs and in this institution, like a well-resourced institution, how do you exercise your influence to say, as an institution, what are we doing for blank? Do we have faculty members who are accessing these federal funds to help influence where those funds are going? So I think we all can play a role in exerting influence about how we like to see private dollars spent, right? And so I think about, folks I know or people I get to speak to, I ask them questions about sustainability and they're like, oh, what's that? Or hadn't thought about that. So I do just think even bringing it up in more conversation and making it more proactive, people will talk about affordable housing. They are quick and ready to give money to affordable housing. But all of the other issues, surrounding circumstances, infrastructure, not so much. So I think even just building that into the conversation when someone says public housing, ask them about resilience. Will it be resilient housing? And then begin to engage in dialogue to have decision makers at least thinking about these issues more holistically.
And I'll just add very quickly, if you're looking to think about, there's so many things I think you can get involved in when it comes to all the federal funding. Currently, there are so many opportunities to sit on these federal review panels to decide where these funds are going. And so I was just on a panel for a federal agency that was a funding opportunity that was close to $30 million. And we got to sit and reconcile. And so those are the places where you're able to see budgets are reflections of priority. And so when you sit at the table, you're able to set the priorities. And you'd be surprised, not even surprised, but think about your degree of influence. You can do that work now. You all can be deciding where billions of dollars are going currently in your roles as student and beyond. And so there's some things that even in the immediate that are possible in terms of that degree of influence.
Okay, thank you all so much. Thank you to our speakers, our discussant. Thank you to our videographers for capturing this. We hope to have some aspect of this documented conversation accessible at some point. We cannot say when, but we appreciate you all being a part of the conversation. We appreciate your perspectives. We appreciate the seriousness with which you have shown up to this space, and we hope to see you at our future events where we'll continue conversations in a very interdisciplinary way. So please do share when you see the This Week at Georgetown or what have you. We have our site, blackrestorativeecologies.org, where we'll post our upcoming events. We also have a reading group that is open to students, faculty, staff, anybody who's interested, where we are also discussing readings that are intersecting with these issues. So if you're interested, please check out our site. You can sign up. We'll keep you in the loop about when we're meeting. But thank you again so much for supporting this event.